So good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Kolsky, and I am the director of the Albert LePage Center for History in the Public Interest and an associate professor of history at Villanova University. And tonight, we are very excited to be hosting, as I was telling the panelists before, the 17th event in this year's 6-month-long series on decolonizing history. Many of you have been with us now for many months. Every month we explore a different theme, and our 6th and final theme is called Decolonizing COVID. So this event this evening, called Decolonizing Vaccines, will be followed up by the final event of the series next Wednesday at 12:30, which will be on decolonizing COVID with two very preeminent scholars, Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith, who is currently co-chair of the Biden Health Equity Task Force, and Dr. Sherelle Barber, who is an epidemiologist at Drexel. So I will pop info about that into the chat. But for tonight, we have a very fantastic multidisciplinary panel featuring two historians who work at the intersections of other fields and one economist. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. And the format for this evening is going to be basically 60 minutes of us having something of an informal conversation, followed by 30 minutes of question and answer. So as the evening unfolds, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I'll pop articles and relevant kind of material into the chat for you all. And around 7, we'll plan to stop talking and bring all of you into the conversation. So tonight we have three people on the panel. Our first panelist is Dr. Merlin Chowkwanyun, who is the Donald H. Gemson Assistant Professor of Sociomedical Sciences and a core faculty member of the Center for History and Ethics of Public Health at Columbia University. His work centers on the history of community health, environment health regulation, racial inequality, and social movement activism around health. His soon-to-be published book, is it out yet, Merlin?
He's muted.
No, but shortly this year.
Shortly, very soon to be published book titled All Health Politics is Local, Battles for Community Health in the mid-century United States will be published by University of North Carolina Press later this year. And he is currently working on a new project about political unrest at medical schools and neighborhood health activism during the 1960s and 70s. He is the principal investigator of a National Science Foundation funded project called Toxic Docs, which makes available more than 20 million pages of previously classified documents on toxic substances. Our second speaker is Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is currently professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She previously taught at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for over 3 decades. She is the author of over 19 books, over 200 scholarly articles, as well as many publications that are public-facing. She's received several international prizes, including the International Labor Organization's Decent Work Research Prize for 2010, the Nord-Sud Prize for Social Sciences in 2010. She's advised governments in India and other countries, including as chairperson of the Andhra Pradesh Commission on Farmers' Welfare in 2004. And she served as a member of the National Knowledge Commission of India between 2005 and 2009. She is the executive secretary of International Development Economics Associates, an international network of heterodox development economists. And she has consulted for a host of international organizations. She is a member of several international commissions, and she regularly writes for popular media, including newspapers, journals, blogs, and other online media. And our third and final speaker is Dr. Farren Yero, who is currently postdoctoral associate in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University. I believe I saw her tweet that she is the winner of an ACLS fellowship for 2021-22. Congratulations. She is a scholar of Latin America and the Caribbean, specializing in gender studies and the history of race, health, and medicine. Her current book project, titled Atlantic Antidote, Race, Gender, and the Birth of the First Vaccine, is a study of early modern vaccination and family politics in the Atlantic world. Her writing has appeared in the Recipes Projects, the Panorama, and Age of Revolutions, and her research has been supported by a variety of major foundations, including Fulbright Hayes, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the John Carter Brown Library, the Newberry Library, and ACLS. So we are very excited for this esteemed panel. We have a lot to talk about. The topic for this evening is vaccines and vaccinations. And in preparing for tonight, you know, I was doing, every time I prepare for one of the events, I sort of just take a deep dive into a different field. So I was diving into this field of vaccinations, vaccines, and the kind of the current status, and I was positively alarmed. I'm not sure if these are familiar statistics for many of you, but the UN has reported that 10 countries have administered 75% of vaccines worldwide. And there are 130 countries representing 2.5 billion people, 2.5 billion people who have yet to administer a single dose. As of March 30th, according to the New York Times, only 0.1% of vaccines had been administered in low-income countries. So this just raises so many questions, so many questions. And, you know, when I'm thinking about it, internationalizing the conversation that we've been having in the United States is so important. In the US, we focused a lot over the past year about how racial disparities in this country have impacted COVID infection and mortality rates. We keep hearing the president and Jill Biden reminding us that help is on the way. And, you know, we're in this kind of positive mood. Yesterday kind of took a decline with the Johnson & Johnson news, but nonetheless, we have this kind of sense of optimism in this country and this claim that all, you know, Americans will be vaccinated, adults, by this July. But what we focus a lot less on in this country is on the global North-South divide that is shaping the development and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. This is where I'm really excited to talk to Jayati. Jayati has published some excellent public-facing pieces over the past few months. In November, she published an article titled Vaccine Apartheid, in which she discussed global health apartheid and the increasing global inequalities produced by what she calls an every country for itself approach, something that others have referred to as vaccine nationalism. And, you know, I thought of this when I heard President Biden recently say, we're going to start off making sure Americans are taken care of first, but we're then going to try and help the rest of the world. Try and help the rest of the world. And last month, Jayati followed up with another really provocative piece titled The Political Economy of COVID-19 Vaccines, in which she explores how the North-South divide is shaping vaccine access and lack thereof, I should say, worldwide in very specific ways. So I would love, Jayati, for you to talk to us a little bit more about what do you mean by this idea of vaccine apartheid? I've seen others use it, so I'm not sure if you invented the phrase or if this is already in circulation. And if you could just talk in specific ways about how the production and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines has exposed and intensified global inequality. Would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I mean, you know, I have to tell you, I'm so delighted that you are raising this issue, because I frankly have been appalled at how little discussion there is about this in the US. It's not on the news, even in the sort of liberal or progressive media. It's in the New York Times, it's on page 17 or something. Nobody gets to read it. It's not in the public consciousness at all. And I feel that if more people knew about it, they would not allow such an appalling state of affairs to continue. So let me explain exactly what is going on. When, you know, the development of these vaccines is absolutely extraordinary. It's a real tribute to what you can do when states put their mind to it, because it's really government money, which has massively subsidized a bunch of pharmaceutical companies and which has provided its own prior research to them to get to this point where you've got vaccines really within a year, which is unbelievable, really. So that's wonderful. That's great news. However, the minute that these vaccines, the first ones, were actually developed and then approved by the FDA and by, you know, various WHO and so on, 14 countries had taken 86% of the entire production for this year. For 2021, they had already bagged it, just 14 countries. And you mentioned the number that 70% of vaccinations, it's actually even worse. It's 87% of vaccinations have already happened in only 12 countries of the world, who represent 14% of the population. And you already mentioned how there are billions who have not got vaccines. People are dying because of this. So what did they do, these rich countries? There is a thing called COVAX that was set up by WHO and the Vaccine Alliance. The idea was that you would have a global facility that would get together all the vaccines and distribute to every country equally, according to their population. So you first get it for your frontline workers, then you get it for 20%, the elderly, those at risk, then you get it for everyone. But they didn't stop countries who are members of COVAX, like US or Europe or any of the rich countries, from doing side deals with the vaccine companies. So what did these countries do? They did side deals with Pfizer, with Moderna, with Novavax, with AstraZeneca, with every promising drug company, and basically grabbed these vaccines. So it's we were talking, you're saying decolonizing the history, we have to decolonize the present. So they grabbed these vaccines, and not just enough for their population. Canada has booked 11 times the number it needs. The United States has booked 4 times what it needs. It is going to, in July, it will have a surplus of 500 million vaccines. Europe has booked more than 3 times what it needs. It's a different matter that they're then very incompetent in the internal distribution. That's another scene. But the very fact that you've backed them means other countries cannot even access these. So, when all this time, the United States is still not saying, the Biden administration is still not saying, we will distribute from now because we don't need all those extra vaccines. And there are countries where, as I mentioned, people are dying because they cannot actually get either the vaccines or the treatment. But that, I just want to make one more point because it's very important. There's this notion that, well, you can take whatever there is now in the available supply, and then you can give to the rest of the world, which is still understandable, except that, this available supply is an artificial shortage. It doesn't have to be just this number of vaccines produced. Why is it so scarce? Because you have given intellectual property rights, patents, to these drug companies, and they now have complete monopoly over the technology that makes that drug, and they're not sharing it. So here you have 16 billion that the United States has given to all these drug companies. I mean, the money that has been poured into vaccine development is enormous. And I'm saying it's good, it's a good thing, but it is public money, it's taxpayers' money that has gone into these. All the profits are being raked in by these pharma companies because they control the knowledge and therefore the ability to produce. Now, why can't the governments of these countries say, look, we have paid for you to develop this technology. Now you please go and share it. We will give you a reasonable return on this. You can license it out with a reasonable return, but you cannot say nobody else can produce it and then charge what you like, which is what is happening today. India, South Africa, and a bunch of developing countries brought a proposal to the World Trade Organization saying, for the period of the pandemic, please suspend patents on drugs, on vaccines, on all the COVID-related things, ventilators, masks, everything you need for COVID, just for the period of the pandemic, because we have to control this thing. It's being blocked 8 times by advanced countries, including the US government. Now, I cannot believe that US citizens would want this to happen. I am sure that if they knew what is really going on, they would tell their government, for God's sake, support this proposal. Because the only group that benefits are these big pharma companies who have already raked it in. Pfizer spent, by its own estimate, $4 billion on the R&D, which was actually done by a German company that got German government subsidies. It is expecting $14 billion in sales this year, just this year, from this vaccine. Now, surely this is not necessary. It's not just obscene, it is counterproductive, because if you do not vaccinate the whole population, these mutant variants are going to emerge and those vaccines are going to be ineffective in a few months' time. It's not going to help even the population of the rich countries. So I'm convinced that if people in the US knew more about it, they would put pressure on their own government to actually support a suspension of the patents during the pandemic.
I welcome any panelist to jump in at any point, right? I mean, you're welcome to follow up. Merlin, I see the wheels are turning for you. I don't know if you have any thoughts. You know, when you mention, Jayati, that we need to decolonize the present, it does sort of, and everything you're talking about in your work, you use, for me, language that has very strong resonances with colonialism, right? The scramble for vaccines, which is associating colonial discourse with late 19th century scramble for Africa. The vaccine grab, which seems like the 21st century variation of land grabs that we saw, you know, with white settler colonialism. So, you know, this brings me to our resident historian on the panel, one of the two, Farren, which is, you know, Farren, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how to think historically about vaccines. You know, these are not, as your own research has shown, these are not new dynamics, or the ways in which geopolitical rivalries are shaping these global dynamics is not something new. So I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how global inequalities and how these geopolitical rivalries have defined the power politics of vaccine development and distribution in prior centuries.
Absolutely. Well, I'll say thanks also, Elizabeth, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be part of this panel and to learn from my colleagues. I guess I can start by saying that I think with the history of vaccines, and particularly the colonial history of vaccines, one of the things that I think is really useful is that we see that there are a number of issues that are refracted today that have characterized the development and distribution of vaccines really from their inception, which happened at the end of the 18th century, turn of the 19th century. And so by studying that history, you know, first and foremost, what I think we see and the Jayati is really illustrated here is that vaccination, this thing that we might think of as being apolitical, right, an apolitical medical advancement, like all forms of medical science, are inherently political. And by that, I mean that the technology in any given moment is embedded in the specific economic, cultural, social context in which any specific vaccine is developed and distributed. And so the historian, Nadia Durbach, in her book, Bodily Matters, I think really puts it well when she says, and I've brought a quote in, she says, "Who wielded the needle or the lancet and whose body was marked governed how vaccination was experienced and the meaning attached to it," right? And I think that we can extrapolate from that and really think about what it means for this practice to not, that it can't be separated, right, from the context and the experiences of the different people who are involved in this, right? It's not a universal experience. And if I can, one example that I think is helpful from my own research on the very first vaccine, right? So you mentioned the birth of the first vaccine. It's part of my book title, is on the smallpox vaccine. And so in the moment that vaccine came into the world, the particular context was the age of revolutions. So the smallpox vaccine made its way, was transported to the Caribbean, to the Americas shows up in the Caribbean in February of 1804. So this is literally 1 month after the Haitian Revolution has come to an end and Haiti has declared independence from France. And so, for context, right, this is the first free Black nation founded by formerly enslaved people. And it's in this moment that, the Spanish King Carlos IV, sponsors this royal expedition to distribute the smallpox vaccine to his subjects, with the explicit goal to vaccinate his entire empire, right? And some historians in the 20th century described this as the first global health mission, and particularly in those terms. And in the moment, right, in many ways, the vaccine was offered explicitly in exchange for colonial loyalty. And the expedition would then go from Spain to the Caribbean, to the Philippines, really around the world, back to Europe. But what it didn't do was it didn't stop in Hispaniola, in the island that would become Haiti, in the Dominican Republic. And I think that's a really significant example, because as another historian, Bianca Premo, has put it, and she says that vaccination was more than a medical project. It was an antidote for race rebellion and anti-colonial revolution. And so that's part of the argument where I'm actually drawing the title of my book from. And so all that to say, I don't think it's an accident that the smallpox vaccine arrived to Haiti when it did in 1816, a decade later, after it reached the shores of most New World polities, right? And I think what's also important is that when the vaccine did make its way to Haiti, it was through completely different circuits. It was through abolitionist networks. And so these are people who had different investments in this technology about what vaccines could do, right? Different reasons for why you would vaccinate your subjects. And I think one thing that tells us is that despite the global reach of a contagious threat like smallpox, then as now, geopolitics and geopolitical rivalries bound up in very specific ways to capital and to ideas about economic stability determined which states would have access to epidemic prevention and which ones were going to remain at risk. So for me, all that to say that the utility of thinking historically about vaccines and medicine in general really isn't to find a specific model or a lesson that can be extracted and replicated into policy. And I think there's been kind of a push to do that this year with the history of medicine, to look to past examples to see how we can create concrete policy. But it's to make legible how colonialism, how slavery, how white supremacy organizes the multitude of ways that people access healthcare. And so, who is likely to be more exposed to risk? Who gets to dictate, what constitutes a risk? And ultimately, who is deemed disposable in a world order that's shaped by colonialism that prioritizes the accumulation of capital, right? So exactly what Jayati is talking about, right? The idea that the profits of these handful of pharmaceutical companies are the thing that's being prioritized in terms of global health policy instead of human life, right?
No, what you say about, and I didn't know that about Haiti getting the vaccine 10 years later. It reminds me, Jayati, of what you talk about in your piece about vaccine diplomacy. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, it's quite strange because here we have the rich, advanced countries basically preventing other countries from getting access to vaccines, either the ones that have been produced or preventing them from being produced more generally. And then they're really angry that countries like Russia and China are distributing these vaccines free to a lot of developing countries. They're saying, oh, look at that, they're using this for vaccine diplomacy and try and increase their soft power. Sure, but at least they are distributing free. Now, the trouble is that there are concerns because, so many of them didn't go through the right trials and all of that. But let's be clear, none of the vaccines that are in use today, including the ones that are being used in the US, have gone through the normal trials. All of them are emergency authorization. And normally it would take 3 or 4 years to get all the full trials complete and everything there. So it's true that the Chinese and Russian vaccines were even more rushed than that. But at least they are making them available to the rest of the world. At least they are trying to promote their production. And yet you have the advanced countries that are hoarding these vaccines and not allowing other production of those vaccines, saying, how dare you go out there and offer your vaccines to these developing countries? That you shouldn't. And they're really upset about this. Vaccine diplomacy is seen as a bad thing. It's not seen as an expression of international solidarity, which obviously doesn't mean anything anymore to rich countries. So I find the use of those terms, nationalism, it's very obvious and evident. Diplomacy is also seen as a bad word, that you're using the vaccines to promote diplomacy. The very idea that a country may, Cuba, for example, has offered to, once its vaccine is approved, is offered to make that technology completely available to everyone. That will be castigated as a sign of Cuba trying to increase its soft power. It's appalling the way in which we have allowed our minds to get so completely commercialized in a way and distorted by these perceptions of what constitutes international solidarity.
Yeah. Farren, you had mentioned this notion of white supremacy, and in your one of the articles, which I think I just popped in the chat, or I'll pop the other one. You had a couple that were really interesting. You talk about this whitewashing of vaccine history, which I thought was a really evocative description. So I wonder, why, if you can talk a little bit about what you mean by whitewashing history. I mean, you talk in your piece about the relationship between slavery and vaccine history, and going back to Jayati's point of how everything's gotten turned around. You make this argument in your piece that the smallpox vaccine in the 19th century provided a humanitarian argument against abolition. right? So we have, right, and so, okay, let me repeat that, because that sounds like the world upside down. A humanitarian argument, we have to have a humanitarian argument against vaccination. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how vaccine history has been whitewashed, its relationship to slavery, and how on earth there could be a humanitarian argument against abolition.
Yeah, absolutely. So the piece that you mentioned, right? So the title is an eradication, empire, enslaved children, and the whitewashing of vaccine history. And without getting like too much into the weeds of that piece, the general argument that I'm trying to make is that the smallpox vaccine, again, from its inception, allowed Spanish colonial officials that they looked to this new technology, right? This kind of novel thing. And I can talk at some point, right, about what really modern vaccination entails. It's slightly different than how we think about synthetic vaccines now, because this was the first moment a vaccine was available. So there were a number of people who were trying to use it against, syphilis, against yellow fever, as if it was going to really be this panacea. But that said, Spanish colonial officials looked to it to eradicate, and this is what I mean by an eradication, right, of both disease, but also the evidence of the violence of slavery, right, to turn to medicine to do this kind of, this paternalistic work. And, to make sense of that, right, some context, this is a moment where you have, so this is the beginning of the 19th century, you have anti-colonial and anti-slavery rebellions taking root across the Atlantic world, right? So the American Revolution has happened, the Haitian Revolution has happened. In about 10 years, most of Latin America will revolt from Spain. So this is a very politically unstable moment. So during this period of time, right, imperial authorities back in Europe are concerned about losing their empires, right, losing their hold on their empires. And part of that was this compulsion, partly motivated by abolitionists, to address the violence of the slave trade and to reform the inhumane treatment of enslaved peoples. So this period often gets called the Age of Amelioration. So what you see is new slave codes that are published about, reducing working hours and about dictating policies around, how much torture is okay, right? So all of this is about attempts to mitigate the worst horrors of slavery so that they can maintain the status quo. And the Spanish look specifically to the smallpox vaccine to, ostensibly remake what they would imagine to be a more humane slave trade. And in doing that, they're turning to medicine, but they're also reanimating much older claims to protect and save the colonized subjects that they deem in need. And all of that is bound up in attempts to legitimize their own political authority in the Americas, right? So this is, again, this moment where royal authorities are concerned about revolution. So in all of that, what I'm concerned about and I'm interested in is how healthcare gets proffered as a means to maintain those colonial relations of power. And I'm not unique in that capacity. It's a central concern of a lot of historians of colonial medicine. But one thing that really comes to the fore in my research that I think parallels with contemporary things we're seeing now in terms of vaccine equity is this concern over trust and consent. So who is trusted to provide care and who is trusted to speak competently about their own body. So in my work and those of others who are working on this period of time, we see how colonial attitudes that are shaped by assumptions about race, gender, sexuality, ability, all of these are framing who is allowed to consent and who can refuse medical interventions. So in the Spanish case, you see this kind of strange law get disseminated that vaccination is actually voluntary, that parents have to consent to vaccination. And I'll say, when I started my research, that was one of the things that kind of drove it, because I did not expect colonial bureaucrats to be particularly invested in the freedoms and liberties of its colonial subjects, right? You expect violence, you expect coercion, but consent, and that's the language that gets used, right, is deployed. So this is a moment where you see this language of rights and consent dovetailing into medicine at the same time that you see doctors and officials turning to the slave trade as a source of bodies to physically reproduce and conserve what is the lymphatic fluid. So that's what the vaccine is at the time, right? So they're harvesting lymphatic fluid from enslaved peoples, circulating it through the bodies of enslaved children, And part of the way that doctors justify their reliance on the slave trade is by arguing that it's enslaved people themselves who are responsible for the smallpox outbreaks in the first place. And again, right, so instead of challenging the economic system, so the slave trade and slavery that was predicated on the conditions that are producing these health crises, what colonial officials do instead is they harness these abolitionist calls for reform to justify the continued regime of enslaved labor, right? So they deploy this narrative that, it is the responsibility of a Catholic state to care for these poor souls, for these poor bodies. And then in turn, it's the responsibility of enslaved Africans to lend their bodies to this cure. So that's one of the ways that this gets depicted as a humanitarian practice. The vaccine, provides colonial authorities that kind of rebut to abolitionists themselves. But what it also does is it makes it safer for merchants in these Atlantic societies to continue practicing the trafficking of enslaved people without the risk of an epidemic. So, through this logic, you get doctors who ultimately then secure a perpetual supply of bodies to then continue replicating and reproducing this vaccine at the same time that they're encasting enslaved people, both as a contaminant and as a remedy, and of course, only one that the state authorities can manage. So when I say whitewashing, there's a long way of getting to this point, but when I say whitewashing, what I'm referring to then is how colonial doctors and officials are framing their interventions as an act of care that gets archived as such, and then gets kind of replicated in historical narratives that celebrate these forms of intervention as humanitarian. So in my work, to tease all of that out, one of the things I'm doing is showcasing, both the reliance on the bodies of enslaved people and on the very economy of slavery to produce the vaccine that authorities are looking towards for political legitimacy, and how that sits with the so-called right to consent, for other parents that are recognized by the state as being capable of child rearing, to be able to make reasonable medical decisions for themselves and for their families. And today, one of the things, when we talk about vaccine equity, I think right now, right, we're mostly talking about in terms of global access, so which countries get which vaccines and when. But built into that is also this concern about, who gets to consent or refuse certain vaccines. And I think that the colonial history of vaccination really illuminates some of the limitations to how we think about consent. We know that there are unequal power dynamics that shape the limits of individual choice. But one of them, that I think is really key in pulling out is this unspoken moral responsibility that gets embedded into the obligation to make the right choice, right? To choose the vaccine that is proffered to you. And then in distinct instances, right, how that gets dangerously encoded through biology. So it becomes incumbent upon certain bodies to do certain work on behalf of the state and society. And, and that gets back to this issue of risk, right? So whose bodies are deemed a risk, whose risk matters when we're deploying a vaccine, particularly an experimental one. And, I've been thinking about that a lot this week. You mentioned the Johnson & Johnson kind of hold. And I think today, the CDC Advisory Committee, right, is deciding whether or not they're going to go through and allow the continued rollout of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in the United States. But there's been a lot of discourse about risk and kind of interesting, both racialized and gendered in very specific ways too, right? That is being compared to the risk of blood clots in birth control. And we can talk a little bit about how that's getting depicted. There are different types of blood clots, but I think the assumption of risk that women's bodies are supposed to take the birth control is kind of being dismissed in order to justify the continued rollout of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But I think by thinking about the history of vaccination and the colonial history of vaccination, we can think a little bit more about the racial and gender politics of risk itself, right? And how it's getting depicted.
I'm wondering, Jayati, how now that we're now this Johnson & Johnson, I mean, I read recently that Biden had agreed to produce 1 billion doses in India. I wasn't clear if that was for the Indian market or for export, but my understanding of Johnson & Johnson being a one shot that requires less refrigeration, that it is better suited to low-income countries that have load shedding and kind of power problems. So what are your thoughts about that?
No, I definitely think that the AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and a couple of others that also need only refrigeration, they're part of the usual kinds of arsenal of vaccines, those are much better suited to the entire world and to developing countries in particular. I don't know enough about the science of it. Certainly, it appears that just like the AstraZeneca thing has been through all kinds of ups and downs, where it turns out finally that the risks are no more than they are in a normal population. It's hard to say in these things about this. But definitely, I think there's a real concern that certain companies have actually been given privileged access to approval, both by the FDA and by the European Medical Agency and by the WHO. So, for example, Pfizer and Moderna apply for approval in October, and they get it by the end of October or early November in WHO. The Russian Sputnik 5 and the Chinese 2 vaccines, Sinovac and Sinopharm, have applied earlier than that. They applied in September. They're still waiting for approval. It's part of the WHO's fact, they give privilege to certain regulatory agencies. The US FDA, the European, they don't privilege the others. The others have to wait in the queue and go through this elaborate process. Now, if it is such a general pandemic, surely you should be working proactively to check on approval. There are about 6 candidates for vaccines that could be approved if they had been given the same attention that Pfizer and Moderna got. So I'm not saying that there was any particular, sort of bias on the part of the WTO or the WHO, but it's part of a fact that there's a very cumbersome bureaucratic process that everybody else has to go through. And others can jump the queue because the US FDA is behind them, or the EMA is behind them. Ultimately, these are all risky. They're all risky. We don't know. We don't know with the RMNA techniques whether, what they will do, because this is all completely new technology. And normally, vaccines would have gone through a process of 3 or 4 years before you would approve them, like the Ebola virus vaccine, like all the other vaccines. So let's face it, these are all risky. It's not that one is necessarily more risky than the others. And I think the way it's being projected in the media is really ultimately privileging some of the big guys in terms of the big pharma companies, that these are safe and can be trusted. And well, the others are a bit dicey, which can have a huge impact on people willing to take the vaccine as well.
Absolutely. So Merlin, we'd love to bring you into the conversation. I know you say you're not a vaccine expert, but you have plenty of relevant expertise. So last week we had Graham Mooney from Johns Hopkins talking with us about, he's a historian of public health, and he was talking about structural violence. And, we know, of course, that it's not, who gets sick is never an accident, right? Like who gets sick, who dies is often not exactly predetermined but structured by other forces. This is what we mean when we talk about structural violence. Certain populations are at greater structural risk of suffering and of death. So from this perspective, right, that there is this existing structural risk, vaccine access is really like the tip of the iceberg, right? It's the end. I mean, it's not the root of the problem. It's the kind of, it's the tip of it. I don't know if maybe that's the wrong metaphor. But I'm wondering, if you think, Merlin, that this emphasis on vaccines and vaccine access is the right emphasis, or should we be focusing on other questions?
That's a great question, and one that I ask a lot as a historian of medicine, because when students come to my classes, I think a lot of them, their previous exposure to the history of medicine is through documentaries and things like that. And so these documentaries tend to have kind of a triumphalist trope underneath it. And it's, Discovery 1, Discovery 2, Discovery 3, bang, we knocked out a smallpox, yay, right? So they often think in kind of a vaccine, what I might call vaccine myopia or pharmaceutical myopia or great discovery myopia. That said, obviously in the short term, and notwithstanding all the very important issues that Jayati has raised about regulatory influence and so forth, I do think in the short term, especially with how encouraging some of these vaccines are in real world settings in terms of just plummeting cases and death rates, the focus on vaccines in the here and now, meaning this year, is probably the right one. And I mean not just developing them, but also distributing them equitably, as the other co-panelists have discussed. I think it's not so much a question of, is this the right or wrong focus, though, but whether one focus might be sufficient unto itself. And that's the problem with vaccine myopia. Vaccines are obviously important. They have huge public health, population health implications, but people tend to only focus on vaccines themselves. I think it's actually really useful to go back to this 2005 critique of the Gates Foundation that was written by Anne Emanuel Byrne. She's a very distinguished historian of global health governance and Latin America. And it was published notably in The Lancet, which is probably one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And Byrne was responding to some targets that the Gates Foundation had recently set, called the Gates Foundation Grand Challenges, the Grand Challenges. And almost all of the grand challenges revolved around developing vaccines and therapeutics. And she said it was fine, but it also, missed a couple contexts in which therapeutics exist. So she basically charged the Gates Foundation with vaccine myopia. So I guess the question is, what are these missing contexts? And I think for her and for me, even 15 years later, they revolve around infrastructure and two layers of infrastructure, I would say. One is just what all of us have been talking about and thinking about in the past few months, which is just infrastructure to distribute the vaccine. Are there enough healthcare facilities? How do people sign up? Refrigeration and so forth, things to actually move the pharmaceutical interventions to those who need them. But the real heart of the critique wasn't that stuff. It was her asking, why were there such high endemic rates of certain infectious diseases in low-income countries in the first place? So she said, yes, it's great to have more of a pharmaceutical arsenal against something like waterborne disease. But the foundation, she argued, really didn't seem very interested in why dirty water existed in the first place. It was interested in developing fancy pharmaceuticals to attack waterborne disease, but not the problem of dirty water itself, even though we know what the solutions are to dirty water. It's an old problem and a relatively simple one to solve at this point. So this was a kind of classic critique of a symptom, not a root, type of thinking. And you can apply this logic to a bunch of diseases, since the 19th century and the rise of medical geography, which Graham Mooney has studied. When people have compared morbidity and mortality spatially, scientists, investigators, they've always found a very tight connection between resource deprivation and poor health. And the nuances vary across diseases, but generally speaking, this is a rule that really just holds up consistently. So with something like cholera, it's dirty water and it's rooted in poor piping and poor physical building infrastructure. TB, same thing. It's poor TB, poor ventilation, poor housing. You're much more likely to develop full-blown TB. And for our time, this doesn't just hold for just the classic scourges of the 19th century, but also COVID as well. So as you said, COVID is a disease that theoretically any of us can get, but the distribution of COVID has been anything but random. And we increasingly know that it is people on the economic margins who have been the most exposed, people who haven't been able to stay home like many of us, people who have not had adequate workplace protections, people who often have to cohabitate with a number of people in small living quarters. And in big cities like Philadelphia, where you are, in New York, where I am, one's occupational position, one's place on economic, on the economic stratum is often very bound up with one's racial position as well. So, if you think of vaccines as the center of a set of kind of concentric circles, people forget, I think, the outer circles, especially in a time like this when the vaccine seems to be such kind of like a miracle panacea and savior from this crisis. But there is a social basis to all these pandemics, including the ones we're going through right now, and I think it's important not to forget that. I'll close on this question by just talking about a phrase: magic bullet. Magic bullet. So this was a phrase that arose in the early 20th century, and then it was sort of refashioned as a pejorative. And what it means is it's referring to a quest for, metaphorical magic bullets. That is, therapeutics or vaccines that by themselves are going to just vanquish a disease, and then we never have to worry about them again. But we know, generally speaking, to Farren's point about the importance of social and economic context, that there's always social and economic context influencing how a disease gets spread, where it gets spread to, and what hatches it in the first place. And so I think it's really important that we appreciate how good these vaccines perform, even as we critique this appalling vaccine apartheid maldistribution of the vaccine. But we also don't want to fall into magic bullet ideology, and that's what I worry about when we talk about vaccines.
I do think there are links as you're speaking. I'm teaching a class this semester on the history of human rights, and just read an excellent book by Jessica White called The Morals of the Market, in which she talks about the neoliberal agenda and the way it kind of appropriated the discourse of human rights in the post-World War II period. So I think there's actually connections, right? So this neoliberal agenda it was threatened by the sort of post-colonial, anti-colonial development economist perspective that says, we need an alternative to capitalism. We need kind of alternative methods of wealth redistribution. So I think there's actually very distinct links, Merlin, between the kind of market, the neoliberal agenda that is favoring these like big pharma companies that Jayati is talking about, and these like parts of the concentric circle that are not being discussed. Like, why is it that many parts of the world have such, including our own, but crumbling infrastructure, right? Lack of access to, power, water. So I think there are very clear historical links in terms of neoliberalism in the kind of post-colonial period. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Jayati.
Yes, I do. But I wanted to also pick up on a very interesting point Merlin made, which I completely agree with, about the ways in which, the whole response to this particular pandemic has been, and particularly the containment strategies. So yes, you're right. There's this whole thing about, vaccinate and then everything's solved, which is a huge problem in itself. But think of the COVID-19 containment strategies, which were first developed in Wuhan, China, and then spread to Europe and the United States. And they're essentially all about the kinds of things that people in poor countries cannot do. Social distancing, first of all, it's a terrible term. I mean, it's really physical distancing, frequent hand washing, maintaining this much, etc. This cannot happen for 40% of the Indian population in urban India who live in slums. You cannot be socially distant. You're in a 10 by 12 room with 5 people. That's how you live. And you're right next door to another 25 people. So the idea that staying at home is safer is bizarre for most people in developing country slums. The idea that you can do this physical distancing for a reasonable number of people, that you can have your little social bubble, is so completely, northern, and I would say upper class northern, not even, because most people cannot do it. The idea that you have lots of soap and frequent water, access to water, whereas we know that in at least 1/3 of the population of the developing countries has to carry water in buckets and store it in these very, very small places. And that they cannot, therefore, have huge quantities of water and soap to keep washing your hands all the time for 20 minutes, 20 seconds, and sing happy birthday while you're doing it and all of this nonsense. So I think there was a way in which the containment measures were completely tone deaf to the lived reality of most people. And it worked for a while because they got away with it. There was some surprising decline in cases in South Asia and so on, despite the fact that none of this actually could be implemented. But now we are seeing the opposite. Now we are seeing India cases are absolutely exploding because some of it is irresponsibility, but most of it is because these measures cannot be followed. So it is incumbent on public health authorities to think what to do in that circumstance. Don't say you have to just create a whole new reality for yourself, which you cannot. So, and also this is done, lockdowns are done where you have 70%, 80%, 90% informal workers, half of whom are self-employed. You deny them all livelihood. And you do not give social protection. Unlike the US and Europe, where there are furloughs, where there is wage pay, there are special handouts, there's exceptional payments made from the budget. This has not happened in the developing world. And so people are starving and people will die of hunger before they die of COVID, but they will also get COVID because they cannot do the kinds of physical distancing required. So there's a sense in which public health authorities in the developing world really didn't use their brains in thinking about the strategies that could be reasonably followed, and certainly didn't provide the kind of social protection you must provide, compensation you must provide, if you're going to prevent people from going out and earning a livelihood.
Interesting. So another thing I was thinking about, right? You're kind of raising this point, Jayati, that we're misdiagnosing, we're misunderstanding of the solution is not matching the problem, which brings me to a question I have for you, Merlin. And by the way, Merlin, there's a couple of requests that you pop into the chat, that Lancet article that you mentioned. So I don't actually have that one. So if you want to pop that in, that would be great. And I'm going to pop in an article that you wrote, which I don't know. I'm curious if this was controversial or not. So, you know, back in, I think in September, correct me if I'm wrong, you co-authored an article with Professor Adolph Reed, who is a professor emeritus from Penn, in which you call for a more holistic analysis of racial disparity rates of COVID-19 cases and deaths. And you mentioned earlier, right, that this problem of economic inequality. So I'm wondering, and in this country, you know, for a very good reason, we've centered the way in which COVID has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown people in terms of infection and death rates. But what are the dangers, in your view, of exclusively focusing on racism as the cause of health inequities? And what happens when we start to shift our attention to questions of class or economic inequality? How does that change the way we understand?
No, that's a great set of questions. I guess I'll first start with what I took our argument to be. So our concern wasn't so much the focus on racism broadly construed. We are both anti-racism and we want to know what causes it. So, and it was how people explained what you call racism. Or in this case, an outcome that many people would characterize as racist, which is the undeniable and distressing disparate outcomes in COVID incidents among racial minorities. So the problem for us is that a lot of the initial reporting, and even now, if you go to things like the Atlantic COVID tracker or a lot of the portals that municipalities have set up, is a lot of the presentation of the numbers, whether it's in media outlets, governmental sources, or scientific journals, they really just present the data like that. So it's like 2 or 3 columns, different racial groups, here are the numbers, you see the disparity, and that's it. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of explanation about why these racial inequalities exist. And again, this is a very common thing. It's very common in public health research. You pick a disease, you show tables where there are racial inequalities when it comes to who gets that disease, but you don't really say much more beyond that. And, you know, a few years ago, I kind of had the realization that there was kind of a cottage industry of racial health disparities research where people were just substituting like another outcome and just saying they discovered another disparity. And so what's the problem with that? I think there are 2 problems. It's of course good to have this data, but it's a liability, especially in the public sphere, when you don't have explanations accompanying this data. Because if you don't have explanations, people can start creating all kinds of explanations post hoc, like kind of these racial just so stories to fill in the blanks. And a lot of those explanations can actually be really racist themselves and reminiscent of certain racial tropes that have historically persisted. So one that's still very common is that there's just something genetically about racial minorities that's different, and that therefore predisposes them to something like serious COVID-19. So, and this in turn is predicated on the long discredited belief that race is a genetically defined concept. You know, population geneticists don't believe this, but this has striking power still in the general population, that race is an actual genetic thing, and therefore it can explain things like these racial inequalities. And another is that there are just ingrained endemic behavioral patterns among members of certain racial groups. So, people of group X act this way, or they eat certain things, or they don't do this or that, and that's harmful to their health and it's risky, and therefore they have higher COVID. And, indeed with COVID, I've seen both of these narratives, the genetic narrative and the racial behavior narrative, from political officials, sometimes in scientific papers, sometimes the press. That is data without context, or worse, data with context, but with bad context, which is these racial tropes. So our concern was what you described. We were concerned about this, and we wanted to call attention to it and say you can't just throw out numbers without providing some kind of rigorous context there. Otherwise, people come up with these sorts of explanations. Our other concern was the one that you described at the outset, and we wanted to talk about the class character of racism or racist outcomes. And that tends to actually disappear when all you do is plop racial inequality numbers on a table and then just leave them there or attribute them to racism. So I actually read a paper yesterday that was calling for new standards for racial health disparities research. And many of the standards were really good. But there was one standard that I thought was a little kind of wobbly and a little tautological. They said every paper on racial health disparities needs to attribute the racial health disparity to racism. But that kind of has this circular quality, because it's saying, we're trying to investigate a racist outcome and we're explaining it by racism. So in this article, this NEJM article, we weren't saying that was wrong, but we actually wanted them to go further, because there are overlapping social processes that produce these racist outcomes. And so we offered a few examples of what these colliding social processes that help produce racism are. So one was just spatial location. So we know from a couple generations of research on environmental justice that it's low-income minorities. Because of residential segregation, they tend to live near toxic waste sites, industrial factories, factory farms, landfills, bus depots, and so forth. And this has a very consequential effect on one's respiratory system, and in turn, the likelihood of developing serious COVID. Another was just one socioeconomic status, particularly income level, because income and monetary resources allow you to access preventative health services that in turn could allow you to treat and prevent many of the underlying conditions we know put you at heavier COVID risk. And it's not just health services, there are all sorts of things that you can obtain when you're more affluent, whether it's healthier food, pharmaceuticals, quality housing. All of these things have an enormous effect on your health. And like residential patterns, SES, again, especially in large cities, is very much bound up with race. And finally, we also said, and I think this didn't get as noticed as much, but we said a lot of the time, sometimes some of the factors we were calling attention to explain these disparities, in fact, don't have much to do with class. So there's actually a body of epidemiological research on what happens to someone if they experience racial discrimination over and over again in their life. And it turns out, rather disturbingly, that it can sometimes trigger a long-term stress response that actually has some really serious cardiovascular consequences. And again, that is not great when it comes to COVID risk. So sometimes there are things that contribute to racial inequalities that are very much anchored in a larger economic and class system. Other times they're not, things like just kind of day-to-day discrimination. But what we really wanted people to do was to be more precise about what they meant by racism and what they felt caused it. And yes, not to forget that in the United States and many other places, race or other kinds of categories of difference are very much tied to what you might call accumulation regimes, or the labor system, or class for short.
In another piece that I read by Professor Reed called "The Trouble with Disparity," right, what he noted in there, which really shocked me, was that the collection of public health data in this country does not often include class or income as a category of analysis, which therefore makes analyze, I mean, if it's non-existent data, how would you analyze it? And it just strikes me as so different. I mean, and I don't know if this is something to do with just the US American distaste with talking about class in a society where it's like, you know, everybody could be a millionaire, because on the, you know, here we have Jayati just, you know, speaking with just, you know, off the top of her tongue, right? Just clear figures about income inequality. And in this country, it's like, you know, this world of, this is not an issue that we want to deal with, or I mean, so I'm wondering, why is that? I mean, why is it that, I mean, it's great that race, the question of race and racial health disparities has come to the center of public discourse, right? It's come much too late, right? It's an important conversation. But I think an equally important conversation is, you know, and one of the things that Professor Reed talks about in this other piece was, are we using race as a proxy for class, right? And if all we're going to talk about is racism, and then the solution to that is anti-racism, but if the problem is actually somewhat bigger, broader than racism, if it includes actually income inequality, which we seem to be comfortable talking about on the global stage, right? But we seem to not be so comfortable talking about in the domestic, like in the domestic conversations. I'm just wondering what you think about that. Jayati or Merlin or Farren, I mean, anyone. I'm curious about it.
This is such a profound point, Elizabeth, and I think you're absolutely right. I've really been quite struck at how little class figures. I'm so happy that Merlin raised this and that Farren raised it earlier, because, you know, it's quite remarkable. First of all, you don't even mention working class. You always say middle class. So, I mean, excuse me, everybody's middle class? How does that even work? And what does middle class mean? So there's this kind of persistent, I think it's perhaps 30 years of neoliberalism where you've tried to shove it out of the conversation. Class discourse apparently is just not okay. You're not kosher if you're talking about class or something, which I find has pervaded even academic, you know, epistemes, actually. It's quite interesting. And it's unusual, I would say. I think there is more discussion of class even in Europe and certainly across the developing world. But the way it's being projected in the US is to substitute other identities for it. So that there's a lot of identity discussion, but it's all about, you know, gender, sexual preference, race, etc., cultural identities, which are somehow in a way less threatening than the economic identities. And I think, I mean, there's a purpose to that, clearly. I'm very happy that Merlin raised it. And I think your point is a very profound one, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Yeah, in addition to what Jayati raised, I actually think, so I moonlight sometimes as a historian of McCarthyism. And I've thought a lot about the long arc of McCarthyism over the American Academy in particular, especially when it comes to how we talk about both racism and the economic structure. But there were just so many people in universities in the 1940s and the 1950s who got drummed out for espousing, you know, not just socialist views, but things that were adjacent to it. And I think it's very much shaped how American social science, both in that period, but even today, looks at questions about economic inequality. I mean, when I was a double major in history and sociology, and I was always struck by the language that many of the quantitative sociologists use to talk about inequality. I think nowadays they're a little bit more comfortable with the term inequality, but it wasn't that wasn't the term they used. They always used the term stratification, which kind of had like a geological metaphor to it, as if it was just naturally occurring. But on the race question too, there were lots of civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the American medical profession, certainly, that basically drummed out people who, you know, if there was even a whiff of socialism, you know, you were out. And so you can imagine what you tried to do, what would happen to you if you tried to do a class analysis of racism, or you wanted to investigate the class character of racism. For anybody listening, I think there's, in the 1930s through and 1940s, there was actually a remarkable cadre of Black intellectuals, most of them teaching at HBCUs. Ralph Bunche, Abraham Harris, E. Franklin Frazier, Pauli Murray, Oliver Cox, who are doing this kind of analysis. And it was really hard for them to kind of penetrate the mainstream of the American Academy, not just because of racism, but because of the fact that they were leftists who were trying to bring this class angle to discussions of racism. The other thing I thought about, and I'm actually I love that I'm on a call with someone from the UMass Amherst economics department, because you're kind of an exception to this. But yeah, I was talking about quantitative research, and a lot of the quantitative research in the United States on these social questions is still done in this language of econometrics and statistical associations, and this is extremely useful stuff. But when it comes to things like race and class, and I throw in gender as well, it can often lead to very schematic thinking where people are always trying to control for a variable. So they'll reduce class, which is a very complicated set of social relations about one's relationship to the labor market, to a simple quantifiable variable like income or years of education or something like that. And then they'll say they controlled for it and they found that race was more important, or vice versa. They'll say, when you add class into it, the race effects are not as important. And this is not really how social processes work. They're dynamic, they're messy, they're overlapping, they're very contingent on context, they're governed by politics and institutions. So I've always been grateful to the existence of UMass Amherst economics and a few other economics departments like that for actually introducing those elements there. But as it's very uphill, right? When the rest of the discipline is shaped in this other kind of apolitical way.
But I could hug you, Merlin. You put it beautifully. That is such a problem. This whole decomposition of all these differences into, well, this much is for gender, this much is for race, this much is for level of education. These are the explained differences. These are the unexplained, which is just pure discrimination, which is maybe just a little bit here. It's terrible.
So we have about, we wanted to leave about 30 minutes, and we have about 20, a little bit over 20 minutes for questions. I see some questions in the chat, which I'm going to pose. We invite you to kind of engage with us. Right? We are a Center for History in the Public Interest. So without public engagement, right, what are we doing here? So there is a question here for you, Merlin, which is, can you address how your argument in your wonderful article, this is the questioner says, the strange disappearance of history from racial health disparities research, how does your argument apply, or how does it not apply to COVID-19? Are we falling into the trap that you identify in that article of simply documenting, I think it says radicalized health disparities, but I think it means racialized health disparities? And in what ways do you as an historian believe that public health research into COVID needs history?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, I mean, these political and institutional and social contexts that influence disease, who gets it, who is more effective at mitigating it, and so forth, that Farren brought up, I think history is just a huge, kind of natural past time capsule lab to find that material where you can kind of craft either different theories or different narratives and explanations that go beyond just tables, descriptive tables of the X has this much and Y has that much disease. So I've always in COVID, it's no different in COVID. Even though COVID has only been with us for a year, you can still bring in the history of institutions that in the US case certainly failed big time, and figure out why. You can talk about why some of the determinants of who gets COVID and who doesn't are there in the first place. Like, why is occupational protection so bad in the United States? In the 1970s, when they created the Occupational Health and Safety and Health Administration, there was a lot of euphoria in the labor movement. Finally, we have a federal government organization that's going to look out for workers and make sure that they are protected in the workplace. And we now know that that agency has been very much hamstrung really since the 1980s in terms of actually fulfilling its charge. What is the history of that? There are all sorts of historical questions that I think we should be introducing the COVID debate, and we haven't. One thing, and it's kind of a private little crusade of mine, is to actually get more historians in places where they are not typically invited. Sometimes it's just because people don't think to invite them, but sometimes it seems intentional that they don't want a more holistic set of methodologies and theoretical approaches to the study of something like COVID disparities. I was very alarmed, actually, recently. The National Institutes of Health issued a call for research on structural racism. So NIH is a very kind of, traditional conservative agency. So a lot of people were very happy. Wow, the NIH is using a now very politicized term, structural racism, and they applauded it. But then people started to read the call, and they were kind of astounded by how limited the scope of the research they were interested in was. They were not interested in qualitative studies, and they were mainly only interested in evaluative studies, those things that looked at interventions and determined whether they worked or not, and that sort of thing. And that's important, but that can't be the only way we talk about racism and COVID-19. So I think we have a lot of institutional barriers to introducing this analysis into our study of into our conversation about COVID-19 racism. And there's lots of institutional barriers. And to answer the first question, I think it's very important that that analysis makes its way beyond our history circles.
Here's a good question. What steps could be taken to form global public organizations to address vaccine availability, for example, in opposition to the current reliance on private company production, big pharma production? What are some alternatives? I mean, Jayati, you noted that I think they had 8 times the effort by South Africa and India to sort of temporarily halt private, patenting was struck down. So what are the alternatives? It's
actually quite simple. One of the alternatives is immediately to actually approve that proposal to suspend the COVID-19 vaccine IPRs and all the other related treatment IPRs for the period of the pandemic. It's been done before by the US, it's been done in wartime, it's been done for other diseases. So there is a precedent and it can be done. The other would be to actually sit on all your rich country governments and say, distribute the vaccines you're not using, give them all to COVAX. The US is going to have, as I said, 500 million surplus vaccines by July. Start distributing them to COVAX immediately so that they can distribute to the rest of the world. There is already a mechanism in play. Finally, we really have to rethink how we are going to do public health in future. We cannot pay huge amounts of money to companies to develop things that can be done. It's human invention and innovation after all. And then say, well, you just keep all the profits and decide what's going to be done with it. It's citizens' money that has gone into this. It's taxpayer money that has gone into this. We should be making it available for the whole world. It is pointless to think of vaccine nationalism. It's the stupidest thing you could do, because these viruses will mutate and come back and get you. So it's absolutely ridiculous to think, well, we're all right because we vaccinated our population and it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the world. It's a fairly straightforward thing that can be done in this case. And if humanity could just, I think if the citizens of the rich countries could realize that these are the issues at stake, it would be a no-brainer. It would be so obvious what needs to be done. It's only because these issues are not presented to the people at large that they're couched in this incredible way where it's said that, oh, if you don't give returns on invention, then no one's going to bother inventing in future, which is such nonsense because all of this has been done already only with public money in the first place. And it's as if there was no invention in the world. In fact, even the polio vaccine or anything else never happened before people could make huge amounts of profit off of them. So I think it's fairly simple what needs to be done right now. But that is an immediate issue. And I think both Farren and Merlin have made this point that these are just immediate bandages to deal with the basic pandemic crisis. But we really do need to rethink our public health systems. We need to rethink how we are going to address the future pandemics and the other huge ecological crises, which will also give us health disasters, in a much more egalitarian way, because already what we've seen is that the current systems don't cut it. They give us disastrous results. So we have to now rethink those systems to be equipped for the future.
Actually build on that before we go. So I'm so glad to hear you say that, and both of your points together. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and you mentioned the polio vaccine in particular, right, is like even the concerns that we're seeing, or the kind of responses to the concern around vaccine apartheid. One of them has been, right, this idea that it is fiscally irresponsible because it will end up costing us more in the end, like the US, right, in terms of GDP. But the response to that is still framed with this very capitalist mode, right, of understanding like the purpose of global health in this way, right? So to go back to this, right, this idea of, you know, and this is why I'm interested in the much longer history of vaccination, is to think about, you know, what are the values embedded in distributing this technology? Why are we vaccinating people, right? And in this instance, right, I think thinking about the different kinds of histories, I think a number of the histories of medicine and histories of global health have come out of this kind of school of thought that is trying to understand global health as a practice that comes out of empire. And has kind of critiqued that and tried to imagine, or tried to kind of show the politics of that. But there are historians who are thinking about different kinds of genealogies of global health. And so one of them is Dora Varga, who's a historian of the polio vaccine as well. And her new research is really trying to think about what are different kinds of global health practices that came out of socialist countries and alliances between them. And so not necessarily having to reinvent the wheel, right? To really kind of think about if we've inherited in many ways, and thinking about who is in charge of dictating global vaccine policy, like what are other examples and what are other histories that have lessons for us that do, you know, really start from that place of you know, egalitarianism, as you said, Jayati, right? Like different ways of conceptualizing the very purpose of public health. And I think that's a really exciting kind of new field that people are kind of pushing directions in the history of medicine.
Can I follow up on that if there's no question? Yeah, so I completely agree, Farren. I'm not part of that world, but you know, I also hope there's more attention and reflexivity within the global health. I don't know if you call it an industry or set of institutions or whatever, but it's always been this kind of bizarre world of, you know, they call the foreign policy establishment the blob, and there's like a global health equivalent to that, and it consists of large organizations like Gates, you know, the Clinton Foundation, mostly large NGOs that are headquartered in the United States and the EU, which, given the performance of these two territories in COVID, are probably the last two people who should be lecturing other nations on pandemic control. And yet the hubris, I think, I haven't seen the hubris quite tempered in a way that one might expect. And I wondered if anybody here, you know, sees that happening. I'm not discounting some of the excellent work that a lot of these global health organizations do, like Partners in Health, to your point, Farren, about more community-based approaches to it. But it strikes me that you know, this kind of distant, you know, very well funded, but on the other hand, very bureaucratic layer of global health institutions is really in for some kind of introspection.
Could I come in on that? Because I think it ties in very well with this other question that has been raised here by A.B. Liu, I think. You know, I think it's fairly clear that the Gates Foundation in particular has been representing the interests of big pharma companies. I mean, in the case of AstraZeneca, it is very open and explicit. This was going to be a vaccine that Oxford University lab had created, which was going to be open access. They were planning to put everything up on the website, all the knowledge, all the technology, everything, and make it available for anybody who wished to produce it. Mr. Gates and the Gates Foundation step in, and of course he has given a large amount of money to Oxford, $435 million, I think. for various health research and say that, no, you should do this individual deal with AstraZeneca because you don't have marketing support, you don't have, you're not going to be able to produce and distribute this vaccine. And so he actually nudges Oxford University into this deal with AstraZeneca, which then AstraZeneca announces that we are not going to be distributing this above cost price. We will not make a profit during the pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic is not defined. And what not making a profit means is not defined. So that AstraZeneca is ending up charging South Africa $5.25 per dose when it's charging the European Union $3.50 per dose. So everything is opaque. And yet it was clearly that this knowledge was pushed into a particular direction. Since then, the Gates Foundation has also been actively lobbying in the WHO and in the WTO against the suspension of patents. So yes, there's a very clear role that is being played in this particular instance, which is supporting the big pharmaceutical lobbies rather than I would argue, the interests of global public health. But there's the question that I wanted to just respond to, which is a very interesting one here, that, the attempt by the Chinese to spread their vaccines in different parts of the developing world, it could well be that it's part of their diplomacy and so on. But the response of the North has really been to counter it by saying, well, don't let them get all of these brownie points. So they're trying to push certain production in India. This whole thing that, President Biden said that India is going to produce 1 million doses or some 100 million doses is really a kind of counter to that. That's ridiculous. The purpose is not to say, my vaccine is better than yours and I'm going to give it to you first or something. The purpose is to make sure everybody in the world gets vaccinated. But that does not, it's somehow descended into this, not even a free-for-all, into this weird kind of first survival of the fittest. That is to say, certain areas and countries will be able to get the vaccine first, and then an indication of power that we will be the ones who will give you this vaccine and save you from further distress in this pandemic. And we will not allow this other country to muscle in and give it to you first. So it's the worst possible way to express any kind of international solidarity. And it does make you wonder that if this is what a small pandemic, let's face it, it's still a relatively small threat. If this is the kind of fierce, primeval tribalism that can be brought out by a relatively small pandemic, what is going to be the response to really existential threats like climate change, which is upon us? I mean, if humanity can't even get together on something relatively small and simple like this, how are we ever going to get together for really facing those big threats and challenges?
Those are tough questions. We only have about 5 minutes, so we're welcoming your thoughts and questions. The other thing, the other issue that's come up around these kind of global inequality questions is this whole new conversation, Jayati, around vaccine passports. Have you been following this, or immunity passports? Yeah. And how this is going to affect kind of differential freedom of movement, right? That vaccine passports will in generally, I don't know, I'm just, this whole argument of vaccine passports sort of, again, widening the gap between global North and global South. Thoughts about vaccine passports?
We're stepping back 2 centuries, right? It's the time when the white men could travel around the world and come and generally drive us nuts. So it's we're back 2 centuries. It's pure colonialism, isn't it? Because you have managed to vaccinate your populations, and now you're saying you get to travel around the world and nobody else does. And so we can come and bother all of you in the developing world and do various things to your markets and your resources and your labor and so on. You can't come here.
A few questions in the Q&A. I see there's a question. Do you think if more people understood that pharmaceutical companies rely on public funding and public innovation, let alone fundamental research into biology, chemistry, etc., would this change their opinion on this vulgar profiteering? I often see people talk about the R&D process without this context.
Absolutely, I'm sure it would. And I think it is absolutely shocking that the popular media here suppresses this to such a degree.
Mm.
I mean, it should be raised every time it's mentioned. Instead, it's a celebration of look how wonderful Pfizer is that they have this, or look how great Moderna has produced it so quickly. We should really be celebrating these companies and thanking them. That's how it's presented. It's utter nonsense. And I think the media has a lot to answer for in this case.
Yeah. And another question that kind of follows up on the conversation is, I think this is sort of following up on Merlin's point about this kind of global health, people who do nothing sort of thing. What is the WH role then besides a nominal role, right? Besides just kind of this bureaucratic role? Now that each company is, now that governments are signing private contracts with pharma companies, what is the role? And this is something that Jayati had mentioned, right? That on the one hand, there's this commitment to reserve vaccines for poorer countries. On the other hand, big pharma signing private secret contracts with governments where they don't have to disclose, right, the cost and all that. So what is the role of the WHO at this point?
You know, unfortunately, the power of the WHO depends on the willingness of the member countries to give it power. So Trump, of course, completely denied it. The Biden administration is bringing it back. But, you know, let's face it, ultimately, it's the powerful countries who have to be willing to give WHO power. It can play a very important role if it is given that power. Unfortunately, I don't think there's enough demand, even among people in the rich countries, to make their governments give WHO that power. So that's the problem, really. You have to force your governments to be internationalist. At the moment, they're not.
I mean, this ties into the discussion maybe 10 minutes ago about neoliberalism and the declining power of states to enact public goods and guarantees. And you don't see that just within nation states, but you see that in terms of global governance and lack of enforcement power for everything from the WHO to something like the Paris Accords, which is essentially a voluntary effort. As angry as it makes some conservatives, it's completely voluntary, and there's not a lot of consequences if one fails to meet targets. I'm sure there's some wonky policy wonk type answer to devising some set of institutional mechanisms to enforce that, and I don't know what those would be, but I will say that every week the Lancet has been writing something about vaccine inequity in distribution and what can be done about it. And they're kind of very depressing articles to read because they really lay out a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And then at the very end, the punchline always seems to be, we need to create some kind of entity or some set of accords that could guarantee fair pricing, distribution, open IP and so forth. And it doesn't exist. And, I've been reading a version of the same article every week. So it's a great question that the person asked, because I think this is going to be a challenge beyond this pandemic and certainly for climate change.
You know, I don't think you need the institutional structures because those exist. You have COVAX to distribute vaccines. You have CTAP, the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. It's just that the rich governments are not interested. So it's really just about power. It's about power imbalances. If it's not that we don't have those institutions or those structures that could enable cooperation, it is that rich country governments are not fundamentally interested in that cooperation.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I was looking at the pricing yesterday for an individual dose. I expected it to be some gargantuan sum, like, I don't know, $700 a dose. It's the most expensive one, I think, is like $30. So you take out your calculator and you do a back of the envelope calculation. It's not a monetary thing for sure. It's a will thing, as Jayati says. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I want to thank all of these wonderful panelists. This was an excellent discussion, as I knew it would be. I hope all of you will stay with us. Next week, we have, again, two excellent panelists with us for more of a lunchtime conversation. That will be our last event of the year. That is on Wednesday, April 21st, 12:30 to 1:30. Thank you, Jayati. Thank you, Merlin. Thank you, Farren. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. The recording of this conversation will be posted on our YouTube channel. And so if you have additional questions, I'm sure that, you feel free to email me and I can pass them along to the panelists, and, the conversation never ends. So again, good night and thank you again.
Thank you for really excellent moderation.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.